In The Handmaid's Tale, the protagonist attends a wedding, but it's not just an ordinary wedding. It is a group wedding, a wedding of young girls to young soldiers, the partnerships assigned by the state. Believe it or not, this is a mark of favor in the Republic of Gilead, which is the authoritarian, Christian-inspired regime that has taken over in The Handmaid's Tale. Gilead does its best to degrade individuals. Everyone's activity is very strictly controlled. It assigns the men jobs, usually bureaucrats or soldiers. It assigns the women specific roles within the house. Those who are in favor with the regime are rewarded with arranged marriages. All of this and more is intended to degrade self-esteem, to degrade individuals' values, and ultimately to help the regime maintain control. Self-esteem is both crucial to defending liberty as well as to our own individual happiness. And although it may seem a little bit strange to talk about this in the context of The Handmaid's Tale, which is so dystopian and bleak, the fact is that it dramatizes the destruction of self-esteem, and it gives us a lot of examples of what not to do if we want to have strong self-esteem, and if we want to have lives that are happy and full and meaningful, and if we want to have a society that respects and protects individual liberty. The setting of the book is essentially 1980s America, which has been taken over by a Christian-inspired faction. It's not strictly Christian, but it's largely Christian. Originally, their name was the Sons of Jacob, but now they call themselves Gilead. Their goal is to create a quote-unquote moral world by returning to what they consider to be traditional values. That's quite a broad phrase, but they mean things like hand-making stuff and not using too much machinery and limiting drinking and women not reading, things like that. We'll get into more specifics as we go. They claim to want to solve environmental problems, which is particularly relevant because the country was facing a very steeply declining population, largely as a result of pollution, which was causing a lot of infertility and birth deformities and that sort of thing. The key part of their plan is to divide women into different groups and assign them jobs, essentially. So the main groups we see in the novel are the Marthas, who are responsible for cooking and cleaning, the wives of high-ranking women, who are allowed to remain in their position of wives and they're sort of the most respected of the women, the handmaids, who are essentially sex slaves. They are responsible primarily for trying to bear children for the high-ranking men. And finally, we have the aunts. The aunts are a group of nun-like women who are responsible for education. I mentioned the assigned marriages at the beginning. The aunts are the ones who make most of the choices in regard to that. They're also the ones who assign handmaids to different houses and move them every couple of years and so on. But they're like nuns in the sense that they themselves don't get married and they live off on their own. The whole novel is told from the perspective of one handmaid who's known as Offred. Offred is her patronymic. It comes from the name of her commander during the time period in the novel, whose first name is Fred, so it's of Fred. We never learn what her original name was. But Offred's struggles, her rebellions, her growth give us a lot of room for thought, particularly in my view regarding self-esteem and liberty, because Offred is old enough to have lived before the regime, so she remembers a time before it, a time she had a successful job as a publishing company, when she was able to choose her husband and they had a child together, a time when she had friends, a time when you were allowed to support gay rights, and she's seen all of that taken away, and now finds herself in the bleak world of Gilead. The first lesson, then, that we can draw from The Handmaid's Tale about self-esteem is that esteeming yourself requires knowing that you're good. The handmaid arrangement, as I explained it earlier, means that nobody has choice. The commander doesn't get to choose who he sleeps with. The wife doesn't get to choose that somebody is intruding essentially into her marriage. The handmaid has no choice in the matter. Her only choice was whether to become a handmaid or whether to go to the colonies and die young. And the thing is, sex can be such a beautiful part of your life. It can be a wonderful way of expressing and celebrating your values. But when it becomes a public affair, when it becomes something that other people are choosing and witnessing and interfering in, when it's with a stranger and not with somebody whose values you share and whose sense of life matches up with yours, it becomes humiliating and degrading. Rather than sex being a way to reinforce your value, it becomes a way to denigrate your value and reduce it in your own eyes. And overall, life in Gilead is so constrained. From who you sleep with or don't sleep with, to what you wear, to how you spend your day-to-day life. People really just have few opportunities to make choices in general. And this starts to be a problem when we are thinking about moral character. Being a good person means making the right choices, and when you have very few choices, as is the case in Gilead, then you really don't get to develop that moral character in the same way. Now, you might think, for example, about people in concentration camps, and it's not true that they have literally no choice. They have about 3 choices. For people in concentration camps, so much of their life is constrained that at first glance it looks like they don't have any choice. But there's always a choice, and for people who are in such harsh circumstances, the choice boils down to a few things. Option 1 is you can passively accept things. You can resign yourself to your fate and try to give up and try to turn off your mind. Option 2 is you can outwardly accept your fate, obey so that you don't have to face more pain and suffering, but inwardly reject it. Hold on to your values, hold on to who you are, engage in some kind of mental activity to keep yourself a little bit separate, a little bit resisting mentally. The most famous example of somebody doing that would probably be Viktor Frankl, who, while he was in a concentration camp, essentially wrote a whole book about man's search for meaning in the concentration camp, and then once he got out, he was able to actually write the book and inspired thousands, possibly millions of people by this point. The third option is to decide that you don't want to live under those circumstances and to rebel or to run away and accept that that will probably mean, at best, a lot of pain and at worst, death. That is a choice, and what you choose does say something about you. But it is a much more constrained set of choices and opportunities than most of us face in our day-to-day lives. Most of us have tons of opportunities about how we're going to spend our time, who we're going to talk to, what we're going to say, what we're going to do, what values we're going to support, what kind of career we're going to pursue. We're flooded with choices. And how we make those choices and what choices we make is what forms our moral character. The lesson is to remember that we get to choose and we get to form our own moral character. And this matters for self-esteem because if you want to feel good about yourself, you have to believe that you're a good person. A thief, somebody who robs a bank but gets away with it, isn't caught by the authorities, will still always live with the knowledge that he took what didn't belong to him and that what he has he didn't earn. An honest person who is hardworking his whole life but gets little recognition for his work will always live with the knowledge and the satisfaction that what he has he earned. So given that in Gilead you have very little choice over how you spend your time, women don't get to choose to really make their living at all. Even if they are working for a living the way that the Marthas are, they don't get to choose how they're doing that. It's hardly surprising that women who used to have strong self-esteem, who used to believe that and know that they were capable and able to deal with things, no longer have that confidence. Offred at one point thinks, I used to think well of myself, before the regime. But after certain incidents in Gilead's tyranny, she no longer did. So as I was starting to get up there, it's not just about knowing that you're moral, it's also about efficacy. And by efficacy, I mean the ability to deal with the world around you. And this is not just concrete skills, things like painting or coding, but it's also the traits that are needed to develop those skills, things like rationality and determination, perseverance. If you don't get to develop or use those traits, you start to feel like you are not in control of your life. This is exactly what Offred went through, and as a result, she actually finds herself wanting to steal something from the house that she lives in. She was not a thief before. She had a job at a publishing company that she was very happy with, but she wants to steal something because she feels like her life is completely out of her control. She wants that sense of power over her surroundings, even though she knows it's only an illusion. Efficacy is fundamental to how we view ourselves, how we view our interactions with the world, and how we decide what is appropriate for us. But as the discussion of choice indicates, self-esteem, although it's heavily influenced by external factors, is not entirely shaped by external factors. Unfortunately, there are a lot of modern feminists who don't accept that or who advocate the opposite idea, which is kind of interesting given how much some feminists really love The Handmaid's Tale and how much they've kind of taken it as like a feminist story. For example, a paper written by self-declared feminists called Confidence Culture and the Remaking of Feminism declares that, quote, the brutal effects of patriarchal capitalism are dismissed as trivial compared to women's own toxic baggage, which bizarrely is treated as self-generated and entirely unconnected to a culture of normalized pathologization, blame, and hate speech directed at women, end quote. The whole point of the paper is to argue that we shouldn't be trying to tell women that they should improve themselves, that they should learn to process their trauma and to become more confident in their abilities and to develop lives that really work for them. No. We should be destroying patriarchal capitalism. And until we do that, then women can't possibly feel good about themselves. Really quickly, I want to highlight a difference between the modern world and Gilead, as well as a few real-life serious tyrannies. In most of the modern world, if there are things that are not contributing to our self-esteem or are actively destroying it, social media is one of the things that people often point to. If we feel, men or women, that social media is having a negative effect on self-esteem, we can change the way that we approach social media, we can change the way we use social media, or we can stop using social media altogether. We have those choices. And the same is true for most other situations. If there's a job that is, let's say you have a boss who's really, really negative and is really starting to grade at you, you can find a different job. Might take some work, but it can be done. In Gilead, women don't have that choice. And I may say there are some parts of the world where women also have very, very limited choices. But in the rest of the world, we have so much control over our environments, over who we interact with and how, that to blame self-esteem problems largely on the external world simply doesn't make sense. There's a nice article in the Feminist Current from a couple of years ago where the author Megan Murphy puts it really nicely. She wrote, quote, "We offer young women lies, superficial feelings of validation that don't last, and that lead to mental health issues, trauma, and/or major self-esteem issues down the road, and simultaneously tell them they are victims of systems of power that ensure they are perpetually and inherently oppressed, and there is nothing they can do about that until there's some kind of revolution." End quote. Murphy also argues in that article that modern feminism offers no tools to build self-esteem, that actual self-esteem is built by earning skills, by navigating challenges, and expressing your opinions. In other words, self-esteem is built by building a strong foundation of efficacy, which is built by earning skills and navigating challenges, by making difficult decisions, and expressing your opinions, your values, the things that matter to you. Not by just saying, well, the world is a patriarchal place and there's nothing I can do about that until the system is brought down. Another really powerful influence on self-esteem is guilt and people who try to instill guilt in you. This is a tool of abusers and manipulators. It's also a tool of the Republic of Gilead. As I mentioned at the beginning, the country was facing a severely declining population, and this was largely because of pollution making people infertile. But within Gilead, they blame women for being infertile. It's never the men, it's always the women, according to the authorities. Of course, it's actually absurd to blame people for things that they have no control over or very little control over. And that kind of unearned guilt is totally toxic for self-esteem in any context. But when it's coming from all around you, not just from one person or one source, as it is in Gilead, it's coming from everywhere. It's very difficult to avoid internalizing that. Again, you have a choice, but it is difficult. The regime goes a little bit further. They actually blame victims of crimes, particularly rape, for their suffering. For example, there's a handmaid named Janine who was gang raped as a teenager, and the aunts in the handmaid training center get the other handmaids to chant that it was her fault. This, of course, contributes to Janine's self-esteem breaking down, and it makes also the other women who are involved in that feel really awful about themselves. This shifting of guilt from the actual perpetrator of the crime to the victim of the crime is another form of unearned guilt. And one that is particularly potent because when people are victims of suffering, they often feel out of control. And blaming themselves is a way of creating a sort of mask of control. It's similar to survivor's guilt. If there's a senseless tragedy, some people will feel guilty that they survived and others around them didn't. At first glance, that makes no sense. But if you feel like you did something wrong and that's why this bad thing happened, then the world is orderly and knowable and things make sense. But some tragedies, natural disasters and things like that, are senseless, and some people's brutal crimes are a result of horrible problems or things that don't really make sense. And this is why guilt is such a powerful weapon for the people who are trying to control others. Somebody who feels guilty, even about something relatively small, will accept all kinds of bad things that he wouldn't otherwise accept. Gilead knows this. The authorities use it, and they make it a point to implicate its citizens in its many crimes. The most dramatic example of this is called particution, which is a portmanteau of participate and execution. And we see this happen with the handmaids. Essentially what happens is a criminal is given to the handmaids to tear apart with their bare hands. They're usually told that this person is a really terrible criminal, usually a rapist or something like that, but usually the person is actually a political prisoner. And it's a way of letting them vent their frustration, but also of making them part of the regime, making them complicit. Not that they have much choice. If they didn't, then they would be singled out, they would perhaps be punished. They're damned if they do and damned if they don't. So to wrap up the discussion of morality and self-esteem, if people can't choose to do the right thing, then how can they feel good about themselves? And if they don't feel good about themselves, that leaves them open to manipulation and being more likely to submit to the force and the ideas that others are feeding them. The self and self-esteem. The Gileadian regime glorifies suffering. They cite a Bible verse that links suffering to conception, and so they ban anesthetic during childbirth, for example. And this is just one way that the regime forces people to repress their basic desires. I mean, what could be more basic or natural than wanting to avoid pain? This kind of repression carries out throughout people's lives. They are not allowed to express even the most basic human values. They're only allowed to express the values that are appropriate to the regime. Women are thoroughly objectified in Gilead. They are basically just seen as vessels for producing babies. Women's lives are super strictly limited in what they can do and how they can do it and when they can do it and who they can talk to and so on. Women are not viewed as trustworthy by the authorities and their supporters. A lone woman's testimony isn't admissible in court, for example. They're also not allowed to write, to sing, or to drive. What do they even have to think about if they're stuck in the house all the time? They can't read, they can't sing, they can't create things. This is one of the things that really starts to drive Offred a bit crazy. She starts to worry about her sanity or worry that she's being drugged. At one point, she even reflects that pigs being raised for slaughter are given balls to play with and wishes that she had a similar kind of entertainment. If you limit people's ability to think in the way that these restrictions do, then of course they will not be able to develop their efficacy, and they will also be hindered when it comes to making moral decisions. The mind is like a muscle. It has to be used, or it atrophies. The regime also bans what we might consider self-care. They ban exercise besides walking for women. They ban practically all art, which is important for giving you something to strive for. Now, what about the physical element? Cosmetics and mirrors are mostly banned. People, as I said, can only wear their uniforms, so they don't get to express their style at all. The handmaids have barely any possessions. I don't think the Marthas have many either. So they don't have any expressions of their values, of the things that matter to them, of the people who matter to them. No photos, no souvenirs, no mementos, no gifts. It's quite a bleak lifestyle. Between the lack of personal possessions, the fact that their names aren't even their own, as well as explicit censorship, the women are really not allowed to develop or express their personality. They're only supposed to put forward a face that is acceptable to the regime, which means something very docile and something very stripped of humanity. Offred even thinks at one point, quote, "I compose myself. Myself is now a thing I must compose, as one composes a speech. What I must present is a made thing, not something born," end quote. In a sense, we all make ourselves through our decisions, through what we say and do. But part of that is by expressing what comes naturally to us and what makes sense to us. This is not what people are doing in The Handmaid's Tale. They're putting together something artificial to appease the wielders of force and the manipulators in their society. And what we can see from all of this is that there's no room for spontaneity, for passion, for creativity, for innovation. There's no opportunity for people to create, to produce, or really just in general to act in ways that reflect or develop themselves. Which makes self-acceptance almost impossible, which makes self-esteem almost impossible. Connecting to others. In Gilead, friendship is basically impossible. Firstly, people don't trust each other, because anyone could be a spy. In the book they call that an eye, somebody who's looking out for the government. So you wouldn't want to trust anyone with any sentiments that are not strictly orthodox. Now, some people are able to recognize people they knew from before, old friends, but those old friendships are seen as suspicious. You can't really form new friendships outside the house because when the handmaids go to the shops, which is basically the only time they're allowed out, they're not allowed to talk to each other. But at home, there are all kinds of negative sentiments between the different women. As Offred puts it, in this house, we all envy each other something. But I would argue it's even more than envy. The handmaids resent the wives who give them orders and who would raise their children, and they think that the Marthas look down on them for accepting the position of handmaid. The wives resent the handmaids' intrusion into their marriages, and they look down on the Marthas as lowly servants. The Marthas generally resent the wives who give them orders, and they look at the handmaids as sluts. The result is Offred is very lonely. She doesn't like Serena, who's quite rude to her. She thinks that the Marthas disapprove of her. She doesn't have anyone to talk to. And of course that by itself is quite bad, but it's also really bad for self-esteem. Healthy relationships show us that we can add value to each other's lives. Rational people want to be around us because we add something, because we help them see things in a new light, because perhaps we make them laugh, because we're nice to be around. And when you're able to have those healthy relationships, that is a piece of evidence to show you that you're somebody worthy of esteem. Strong relationships can also provide what's called psychological visibility. It's the feeling of being seen, which happens when somebody recognizes and appreciates something about us or something we've done that's really important to us. So if you think about this in a work context, if you work really, really hard on a project and somebody looks at it and just goes, oh, that's nice, you're not going to feel seen. They haven't noticed or appreciated the things that you put into it. But if instead they notice some element of it that you think is important, you are going to feel seen. Similarly, in romantic relationships, if our spouses don't care about the things that we care about, then we feel neglected and unseen. But if they look at the things that we're working on, if they appreciate the parts of us that we think are really important, really fundamental to who we are, then we're going to feel seen. But as I've said, you can't really develop yourself, you can't really express yourself in Gilead, so how then would anybody be able to see who you are? Self-esteem and healthy relationships have a reciprocal relationship. People with high self-esteem seek to reach their potential, to live out their possibilities, and that includes forming relationships with people who are going to enrich their lives. People with low self-esteem tend to look at others not as multifaceted, complex individuals, but as sources of approval or disapproval. And we see this a lot in Janine, who was gang raped as a teenager, who was then blamed under Gilead for that rape. Ofra describes her as being, quote, like a puppy that's been kicked too often by too many people at random. She'd roll over for anyone, she'd tell anything just for a moment of approbation. Janine, at that point, can only see other people as a source of approval or disapproval because she's been put through so much and she didn't really have a strong sense of self going in. And so what we see is somebody who is looking for approval at any cost and willing to give up whatever remains of herself in order to achieve it. There's another element that integrates a couple of the things we've been talking about. It's very difficult to form moral character in Gilead because you have so few choices. As a result, some people tend to lose respect for themselves, to not think that they themselves are good people. And then they are less likely to respect others. And this is because of what some psychologists call assumed similarity, which is basically the idea that we tend to assume that other people are like ourselves. Our view of the world is shaped by our experience, which of course is heavily dependent on our experience with ourselves. So until we have evidence to the contrary, we tend to assume that other people are going to behave like we do. Honest people expect other people to be honest. Cheaters are more likely to suspect other people of cheating, and so on. An example from the book is that Offred often assumes that others say petty, mean things about her because she sometimes has these petty thoughts about other people herself. She does it, so of course everyone does it. And she also feels bad about herself, so she expects that other people say bad things about her. Relationships can reinforce positive self-esteem or negative self-esteem. In Gilead, it's so difficult to form positive relationships that are actually based on values that relationships can only reinforce negative self-esteem. Liberty and self-esteem. So as awful as Gilead sounds, at least it's only fiction, right? Wrong. Atwood explained, quote, one of my rules was that I would not put any events into the book that had not already happened, nor any technology that was not already available. No imaginary gizmos, no imaginary laws, no imaginary atrocities, end quote. We can look at the regime's horrific policies to learn about real-life tyranny because that's what inspired them. Now, of course, they're more concentrated. This is what fiction does. It concentrates real life into a single character or a single movement or a single event. But all of the specific kinds of atrocities were practiced in some form by real-life governments. And one of the things we can learn from this is that people are more willing to give up control over their lives if they don't fully believe that they're capable or deserving of running their own affairs. If you don't think that you're really able to deal with your life, then you're more willing to let other people do it for you. And Atwood understood this. She wrote in the introduction to the 2017 edition of the book that the Re-Education Center for Training Handmaids was designed to make them feel so badly about themselves that they wouldn't rebel or run away. And this is just one example of why self-esteem is so crucial. It affects us in all areas of life, and it sets our view of what is appropriate for us, what we possibly could achieve. It dictates the kinds of goals that we're going to set. A good self-esteem sets up a virtuous cycle. Studies show that people with strong senses of self-esteem tend to rate their abilities more accurately, they tend to persist longer at tasks, they tend to expect respect in relationships. And then, if you persist longer at tasks and accurately assess your abilities, you're more likely to achieve your goals. That's more evidence that you're good at what you do, and that supports self-esteem, and so on. And the same in relationships. If you expect respect in your relationships, you only stay in relationships that are supportive, then that's going to lead you to have those experiences that I talked about that support self-esteem, like people taking joy in your achievements and reminding you of your strengths and making you feel psychologically seen, and that's going to support your self-esteem, so you're going to be more willing to seek out these positive relationships and so on. There are really very few people who have good self-esteem in the book, but we can look at Offred's best friend, Moira. Moira is the only one that Offred sees run away from the re-education center. She knows that what they're doing is horrible, and she holds on to that and holds on to her values and what she stands for. By contrast, people who have a poor self-esteem tend to get locked into a vicious cycle. People with poor self-esteem tend to think that they're not likely to succeed, that if they ask the girl out, she probably won't say yes, and so then they don't try. They don't set high goals, or if they do, they don't put as much effort as they could into achieving them. And then when they fail, or they end up in bad relationships, it just serves to prove them right. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. For example, Offred doesn't even try to befriend the Marthas in her house because she assumes that they won't want to be friends with her. Resisting other people's attempts to control you takes a lot of ability, it takes a lot of moral certainty. You have to be clear that you are right. Especially when the regime takes the moral high ground, you have to try and take it back. This is nothing short of heroic, and that's why those who have rebelled against tyranny, both in fiction and in real life, are inspiring. It's why we look up to them. In order to be that rebel, though, you have to have strong self-esteem. There was even a study done last year in 2023 that found that, quote, a strong sense of self seemed to provide resilience and empower participants to navigate sexism and other injustice, end quote. In The Handmaid's Tale, there's very little resistance, even to small, senseless restrictions, like not letting the handmaids drink coffee. This is because most of the people who are left don't have strong enough self-esteem to resist. Even though they're miserable, some part of them thinks that it's better if others make these kinds of decisions. The only way to avoid submitting to that kind of a regime is to have strong self-esteem, to know that you are able to live your own life, that you have the right to live your own life, and that the people who are using force and trying to manipulate others are deeply in the wrong. A message of hope. Gilead is chilling in lots of ways, including its similarity to real life. We can think of Nazi concentration camps and Afghanistan under the Taliban and so on. But the novel does offer glimmers of hope. For example, Offred finds the message Nolite te bastardes carborundorum scratched into her closet. The message was left by the previous handmaid, and in a society in which women are not allowed to read or write, it's something that she holds on to. The message is scrambled Latin, originally intended as a joke, but it means something like, don't let the bastards grind you down. It doesn't fix things overnight, but it helps her to stand firm in her identity and to hang on, even though the outside world is trying to drag her down in every possible way. In the same way that Offred drew inspiration from that previous handmaid, we can draw inspiration from Offred. The Handmaid's Tale offers many lessons about the roots of self-esteem and how to build and improve it, from the role of psychological visibility, to the importance of building moral character and expressing your values, to the key nature of choosing how we spend our time and who we spend our time with. And perhaps most importantly, it illustrates the connection between self-esteem and liberty, inspiring us to hang on to the former so that we don't lose the latter.